get to the Philadelphia Eagles. Their offseason in 60 seconds. Hired Kellen Moore as their new offensive coordinator. Hired Vic Fangio as their new defensive coordinator. Extensions for A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, Landon Dickerson, Jordan Mailata, Jake Elliott. Restructured Josh Sweat's contract. Signed Saquon Barkley to a 3-year, $38 million deal with $26 million guaranteed. Signed Bryce Huff to a deal for 3 years and $51 million. Brought back C.J. Gardner-Johnson on a 3-year, $27 million deal. Money is fake to this team. Like money is truly fake to this team. I'm pretty sure they were second in the NFL in cash spending to the Browns, for whom money is also fake. Like the way that both of those teams are doing prorations and pushing money into future years. If you look at the Eagles cap in 2025, it's hilarious because every single guy has $1 million base salary, like almost every single guy on the team, because they've pre-restructured all of the deals that they've signed.
See, I'm going to be honest with you. This is why I'm never going to read that deeply into the cap. I'm never going to understand why or how that is even possible. I will let people smarter than me, like you, on that. I'll listen to the shows that you do on that, and I'll just get it from there. I'll never understand it.
There is a larger conversation to be had about what they're doing and what the Browns are doing and how it's different than pretty much every other team in the league. What the Eagles have done, and they'll do it again this year, they're going to carry over like $30 million in space. So they give themselves some flexibility to sign new guys just because of the money they carry over. The Browns do the exact same thing. So there is like a multi-year plan with this. It's not like what the Saints were doing where it was truly just a year-to-year thing. And they were just like, all right, what do we have to do this year? Like there is more to it than that, but it really has allowed them to operate in a way that very few teams have. Other things here, they traded Hassan Reddick to the Jets, lost DeAndre Swift and Kevin Byard in free agency, Quinyon Mitchell in the first round of the draft, Cooper DeJean in the second round of the draft. Blue chip check-in for the Philadelphia Eagles. What have you got for me? How many?
Yeah, they're kind of a weird one. Obviously, AJ Brown is an easy one. Lane Johnson is an easy one, so long as that he's healthy. I'm willing to put Saquon in there. I think on a good team like this, and if he's ready to go, I'm very willing to put Saquon in there. The one that I was like kind of iffy on and kind of halfway there is Dallas Goedert. He's a really good player, dude, and he is like one of the top 5 or 6 tight ends in the league. Again, maybe he's just shy of that tier, but he's a really, really good player. And truthfully, a great fit for just some of the throws that Jalen Hurts likes to make. So maybe that's the bump, but that's where I landed.
I had 2 to 3. I had Lane Johnson and AJ Brown, no doubt about it. What do you think about Landon Dickerson?
I think he is good. I think he's more in like the red chip category where I just can't quite get there with elite. I think he's a little bit too inconsistent in some ways.
I think that's totally fine. I'm not arguing with you there. That's what's funny about this team, though, is that they probably only have 2 blue chip guys. I think they have more on the second tier than arguably any team in the NFL. Because I don't think these guys, we can make an argument about Saquon. I think Saquon's production over the last couple of years, and I know the situation's been terrible, even like some of the efficiency numbers, etc. I want to see it this year with a better situation before I put him back in that sort of category. So if we're bumping Saquon down, these are the guys I think you can make a solid argument like red chip players for this team. DeVonta Smith, Jordan Mailata, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, Jalen Carter probably, Dallas Goedert, and Bryce Huff was a monster last year for the Jets. Like all 7 of those guys are really good players. So that second line, I think, is more full of names for this team than probably any we've talked about so far, and maybe any we're going to talk about for the rest of these previews.
I think that's probably right. Like they are absolutely loaded. Again, to me, maybe AJ Brown and Lane are the only 2 surefire blue chips, but they've got like almost a dozen in that next year.
And what significant question marks do you think the depth chart has after an offseason where they added like 14 players?
I mean, linebacker is still, it's been the thing for me. It's like, other than TJ Edwards being okay for, a couple of years when he was there, I just have not liked what they've had at linebacker for a very long time. The last good one to me was like Nigel Bradham, who was pretty underrated when he was there. You can always count on me for just a random linebacker pull.
Oh man. Listen, I love me some Nigel Bradham back in the day.
Yeah, and maybe wide receiver 3. I'm more curious about wide receiver 3 than concerned about it, but it is something to monitor at least.
Yeah, when you have Dallas Goedert, Saquon Barkley, AJ Brown, and DeVonta Smith, I'm a little bit less worried about who the wide
Right. Your
receiver
wide
3 is
receiver
gonna be on
three is
this
going to
team.
be your sixth most important offensive guy touching the ball. So, like, who cares?
Your wide receiver 3 is Jalen Hurts using his legs in those
Yes.
situations.
Yes.
That's your wide receiver 3. Linebacker is my biggest one because I do think that even though corner and the secondary in general were issues last year, they added so many bodies this offseason that I think they can get to a place where you feel decent about it by the time we get to week 1. So I think linebacker is absolutely the biggest one. Everywhere else, this team feels pretty solid across the board. I think it speaks to their talent. What do you watch in the first month of the season with the Eagles?
I'm mostly curious to see where we get with this interior of the offensive line. I mean, you lose a literal Hall of Famer in Jason Kelsey, who was still very much playing at that level, by the way. This is not a guy who, maybe his last year or two in the league started to fall off a little bit. No, dude, he was still, like, at worst, a top 3 center, probably still the best in the league. So them losing him, I think, is huge. Not even just for some of the unique stuff that he could do in the run game with how he could pull, how they would adjust some of their zone stuff, all of that. He was helping set a lot of the protections, and I think especially now that they're going into
No,
this
no,
new
no,
offense.
no. Not helping
Yeah,
set.
yeah, not helping, sorry.
Handling all of the protections.
I wasn't yeah, that was a little bit, not as generous as I should have been there to Jason Kelsey. He was their Dak, like, where Dak does it all for Dallas. In Philly, it was all Jason Kelsey. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I remember you talked about on a different show that one example of him just waving Jalen Hurts off. Like, no, no, no. This is the right call. Like, let's just do what we need to do.
So this is, I think, really important to bring up because mine is just how this team is going to pivot or how the pivot to Kellen Moore and whether or not it can rescue this Eagles offense from what we saw at the end of last season, the state that it was in. And the biggest thing with this team, I think, by the end of last year, talking to Nick Sirianni when I was there and other people on the offensive staff, I just think they got to a place where the offense was ill-equipped to give them answers to what modern defenses were doing to them. And the biggest part of that, I think, is just the pre-snap things that we're talking about with Jalen Hurts. And protection was a big, big part of that. They relied on Jason Kelsey to do pretty much everything in that area. And it wasn't just Kelsey over the last couple of years. Nick Sirianni's last year in Indy in 2020, Philip Rivers was there. And so over the last like 3 or 4 years, Nick Sirianni is either the offensive coordinator or the head coach for a team where they could just put all of the protection work on one person. That guy handled it. We don't have to worry about it. They didn't have like hots when Philip Rivers was working in Indy and when he was working with the Chargers. Like, he just took care of everything. He knew where the problems were. He knew where guys were coming from. And that was the same level of work they put on Jason Kelsey. The problem is teams were doing such wonky shit to them that they were never going to figure out what the pressures were and where everything was coming from every single play. And so
That
go
to
ahead.
me is actually the biggest problem. Because so, like, they tried to do the thing where obviously Shane Steichen has run his offense for a while. He knows all the ins and outs. He knows all the counters for if I call this and they start going on it, okay, I'm going to switch to this, all that stuff. They basically told Brian Johnson, like, hey, can you just do all of that? It's like, well, okay, this isn't Brian Johnson's offense. He doesn't know all the buttons to press.
Yeah.
And so it felt more like they were kind of just calling plays and smattering stuff together. And it never felt like it was as cohesive and they knew what the counter to the counter to the counter was. That to me was the biggest issue with this offense. So now, again, who knows how well the Kellen Moore thing is going to go? At the very least, you can say Kellen Moore knows his offense. He's called this at multiple spots now, and he should know the ins and outs, and he knows as a play caller where it needs to be. So in that sense, I think they should be a little bit cleaner.
What happened was they were trying to just carry over all the things they had done from the previous year, and where they sought out evolution, there wasn't any purpose behind it. Like, remember all the two back pony stuff that they were doing early in the season? It's like, okay, well, that's something different, but how is that additive to the previous version of your offense? Like, how is that taking you in a productive new direction? It wasn't. It was just something that was tacked on to the side that felt a little bit different.
And they abandoned it before it could really get to whatever, if they had stuck with it and did almost like what the Chiefs did, where they were just throwing a bunch of different stuff at the wall for the first 8 weeks of the season, trying to figure out what is going to work with this unit. It seemed like the Eagles, in some sense, just gave up on that stuff when they got to some of those places.
So what happened is that when teams started attacking them in all these ways that were hard to predict, like the example that I heard was that when they played against the Bucs in the playoffs, obviously that's deeper in the season, but I think it is instructive. The Bucs were combining certain pressures with certain coverages that they had never done at any other point in the season. And why this was a problem for the Eagles specifically is that as a lot of the league has shifted to a more pure progression place where what the defenses are doing, and even from a protection standpoint, the Niners and teams from that world are hot teams. Like, if it doesn't really matter what pressures you're going to bring, we don't have to necessarily pick it all up. We're just going to be hot. It's going to be on the quarterback. So as those offenses, they're set up to be nimble against defenses that are becoming more murky with what they're bringing, who's playing what position, and what coverage that they're running. The Eagles' offense was built with more pre-snap stuff in mind. So we're making decisions based on certain pre-snap looks. If you're in single high, we're going to do this. If you're in two high, we're going to do this. That stuff is just less equipped to be flexible against modern defenses. And when they were running into roadblocks over the course of last season, their answer was to get simpler because they thought that was the best way to combat this. And then the implosion happens because you're just getting more and more and more insular and you have no answers to anything. So the thought with Kellen Moore is, how can we build in answers and make this thing more dynamic? So they're shifting to a place where it is going to be more, well, it doesn't really matter what the coverage is. We know how we're reading this out. It doesn't really matter what the pressure is. We're going to be hot off this. It doesn't really matter what the defense is doing because we're going to use a bunch of motion to displace them before the play. So I think that their style of offense worked because their players were better than anybody. But when defenses started coming up with answers for how to attack that, they didn't have responses. And the entire point, I think, in hiring Kellen Moore is to give them responses to those sorts of problems.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And you know, Kellen Moore, for as weird as I think the Los Angeles thing went, they were kind of in a spot with Los Angeles where ton of injuries to the skill players. I think even to the quarterback at a certain point where you just probably never got fully what the offense was supposed to be. This Eagles offense is certainly talented enough for him to do all the things that he wants to do. So it's kind of on him at this point.
I'm excited to see how Saquon fits in too. Like last year, if you look at what they were getting out of their running backs, they just felt like there was a ton of meat left on the bone in their running game. Among the 50 backs last season with at least 100 carries, DeAndre Swift was third in yards before contact per rush. The only guys ahead of him, Devon Achane, Jahmyr Gibbs. Of those 50 guys, he was 46th in yards after contact per rush. So the thought is, if we drop Saquon into this situation, with the boxes we're going to get in 11 personnel and with our offensive line, there's just going to be a lot more there than he had when he was with the Giants. And this team, I mean, we know how they operate. They look at things like a stock market. They bought the dip on running backs. Darnell Mooney and Saquon Barkley got the exact same contract this offseason. It was like $38-39 million with $26 million guaranteed. If that's going to be where we are, it's okay to pay running backs. Like that's an okay thing to do with running backs.
That is what I was going to say. If those two players cost the same amount of money, I don't care if I have to put one in the backfield, man. I'm taking Saquon Barkley 10 times out of 10.
And I think that's what happened. I think you had some teams this year being like, nope, we've gone too far. We've jumped the shark. We're not doing this anymore. We're going to pay these guys a little bit more. And I think that's what the Eagles thinking was. What is keeping you up at night with the 2024 Eagles?
I mean, we kind of just did it, but it's just I'm curious and a little bit worried about how much more sophisticated this passing offense is going to be. Just because I think we haven't really seen it from Jalen Hurts. Again, a lot of what they were doing was RPOs. It was a lot of run game, which obviously, if you have a quarterback like him, you should be using him in the run game. And then a lot of, like you said, it's a lot of pre-snap decisions, and that's why he throws so many dang go balls and slot fades. And granted, to his credit, one of the best deep ball throwers in the game. Like he really puts that on the money almost every single time when he gets a good look, and he has two really good receivers who can go do it. But it was a lot of stuff that was kind of predetermined early in the play, and if that wasn't there, it's like, okay, go make a play. And that's a nice way to run an offense. But like we just talked about, eventually you run into a roadblock and teams start to pick up on what's going on, even if you have really talented players. So I'm curious to see how he handles that in a vacuum. Like even if Jason Kelce was still here, I would have been curious about how he was going to handle that.
It was going to be very different no matter who the center was. I mean, you're just playing a different style of quarterback within this offense.
Exactly. But now he has the added pressure of like, he probably has to do more with the protections. I can't imagine.
He's going to.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Definitively, I can tell you he is going to do more with the protections.
Cam Jurgens might be very smart, and he might eventually get to a point where he can do all the protection stuff. I can't imagine right now he is where Jason Kelce was. I'm going to go out on a limb there and say that. So there's just going to be a lot more on Jalen Hurts' plate than I think we've seen in past years, and him coming off a season where he was still good, but not quite as good as he was in 22. Just very curious and a little bit worried to see where it turns out.
I'm totally with you on this because we can, I mean, huff and puff about all the changes and more motion and it being more sophisticated. All that stuff sounds great. But the quarterback played really well in the old system when the old system was humming because it fit the things he did well. So, what is this transition going to look like? And by all accounts, when I was there, and this is optimism season, he's taking to it well, he enjoys it, etc. We'll see what actually happens when the bullets start flying and when teams start throwing wonky shit at him and he has to actually start reading this stuff out and playing quarterback in a way that he's never really been asked to do with this coaching staff specifically. It's not dissimilar to me. There are different nuances to it, but the conversation we had about Lamar last year, where it's like, okay, if you drop him into a more modern offense, what's it going to look like? And I was bullish that he was going to be successful, but there was going to be a question. It was going to be a transition, and he passed it with flying colors. How Jalen Hurts takes to it, that's still a question because we haven't actually seen it.
I think that's actually a great comparison just in terms of the leap these guys are going to have to make. The difference to me was just, I mean, you know my feelings on Lamar. I was 100% confident he was going to handle it well. I can't say I'm all the way there with Jalen Hurts.
I don't have a great answer to this because for me, it's mostly the vibes. Like the vibes are what are keeping me up at night. I wish I had a better answer than that, but you fire your offensive coordinator and your defensive coordinator after a season. And there's been a lot of smoke about whose decisions those were and whether or not that was an Nick Sirianni choice or whether or not that was coming from on high. Whatever the answer to that, sort of irrelevant here. You can read this two ways, that set of moves. One, you can stabilize both sides of the ball. And that was the goal, right? So they brought in a guy who had been a play caller in the NFL on offense and defense. And I think bringing in Kellen Moore has allowed Nick Sirianni to kind of step away from the offense in a manner that he didn't feel comfortable doing last year. So you've seen him more in every positional meeting. He's been more of like a CEO type of head coach than he was last season when he was working with the first-time offensive coordinator. And I think the goal there is, can we be a little bit more attentive on what this building feels like day to day? That's the optimistic outlook. The pessimistic outlook is that this is a lame duck group that is clinging to its last breath. And if they don't get it done and win 10 games and they miss the playoffs, no one's going to blame the roster. No one's going to blame the talent on the team. One, because there's a lot of good players on the team. And two, this general manager is just in a different place in the hierarchy of this organization than a lot of other ones are. So if this goes poorly, that's not where it's not going to fall at his feet. So there are two ways to read it. You could say like they're finally righting the ship. They have people who have done this job in the past, or this is a last ditch effort to save this thing. And if it doesn't go as well as it should, people are going to lose jobs. And I don't know where I necessarily fall between those two options, but I definitely do feel like there is like a bad vibes possibility that could infringe on this entire Eagles season.
And I will say too, I think there is a scenario where they still win 10 games, but this is maybe the one organization, the one general manager that might be like still not good enough by. And it's like,
absolutely.
And Sirianni probably has that in the back of his mind where it's like 10 to 11 games still might not be enough, which is a bad place to be when you're a head coach. It can't be fun.
I mean, they parted with the guy who won a Super Bowl not that long after he won a Super Bowl. Sirianni got to one. They did not win one. So I think that this is a team where they were sniffing around Bill Belichick after this year, 1 year removed from them going to the Super Bowl. So that sort of stuff and those sort of dynamics and the Sirianni-Hurts relationship, all of those things, I do think that there's a little bit of smoke there. And I do think that that is something to keep in mind I think so many people this offseason have been like, why aren't you hiring the Eagles? Why aren't you hiring the Eagles? They have so much talent. They're fixing the offense. It's like, I don't know, man. There's just something there where I need to see it. I need to see this all come together before I believe that everything that was going wrong there has been fixed, because I don't just think it was offensive and defensive schematics. I think that there were things that needed to be tended to. And if those things get tended to, what is this going to look like because of all the talent that they have?
That's exactly where I'm at.
Most important supporting. Oh, no, sorry. 5, 4, 3. What are you most excited about with the 2024 Eagles?
I mean, it's boring, but all the skill player talent, man. I mean, we named a bunch of them at the top, but I mean, come on. AJ Brown is the top 5 wide receiver. DeVonta Smith is as good a number 2 as you're going to get. Dallas Goedert is top 5, top 6 tight end. And then they go from I know the running back room was productive last year because the offensive line was great, but it wasn't a good running back room. You had Saquon Barkley, and if Jalen Hurts maybe looks a little bit healthier as a runner, dude, there is a chance. Like I know we just went on this whole rant of like why this might not work. There is also a chance that they actually figure stuff out and they go nuclear again because the
There
talent is
absolutely
just
is.
crazy.
The upside they have created, the upside case they have created by switching to this sort of offense, the ceiling is so much higher. Like the runway is so much longer for what this team could become. And if it all falls into place, they have a chance to be really, really scary. And my answer is pretty much the same. Like I just cannot wait to watch AJ Brown, this version of AJ Brown, in an offense where they're moving him around and they're dictating matchups rather than taking the matchup when it's there. Like that's what it was over the last couple of years. And they were so good that it didn't really matter. Like you're just taking the one-on-ones whenever you get them and you're torching people when they exist. If you can do a little bit to start creating those and dictating those one-on-ones because the offense feels more dynamic, oh boy, your most important supporting character for the 2024 Eagles is best case scenario, there everyone else in the NFC is going to be terrified. It recorded. It just didn't come through in the stream yard. So your most important supporting character for the 2024 Eagles is
Keely Ringo question mark, but like this is kind of more a proxy for just all of the young defensive backs that they have, because I think it's kind of just a question mark as to like which guys are going to play, where are they going to play, how well are they going to
yeah,
play. We knew going into the offseason that this was an old secondary. They weren't a bad secondary necessarily. It's just that you saw that the cliff was coming, especially with a guy like James Bradbury, and they needed to get younger, and they sure did. And they started with it last year with obviously with Keely Ringo, and then this year with the two guys that they drafted in the first two rounds. So I'm more just curious to see like which guy ends up playing and how well they end up playing. I really like a lot of them stylistically, especially Ringo. I don't even know if he necessarily wins the outside job, but he is in the Carlton Davis, Joey Porter, Prince Amukamara, punch you in the face type of corner. So I would like to see if he gets a crack, but it's kind of just a question mark to see these guys play. At worst, I will say they've got depth. Like, so if something
yeah.
goes wrong, somebody will give them playable stuff. It's just a matter of like what the ceiling is, I guess.
I was there, I think, on August 1st. So that's about 3 weeks ago now. And they were just in a mode where it was like, we're trying everybody everywhere to see what works.
And you
And
should.
I don't think that's really changed that much over the last couple weeks because it's an incomplete set of information because DeJean has been hurt. And so they've been using Quinyon Mitchell in the slot a lot. And Vic Fangio has been pretty open about this. Our Eagles writer, Brooks Cabina, has written about this a couple times. Like, I don't think they want to do that. I don't think they want Mitchell to bump inside and out because Fangio believes that those are two different positions. Like if you look at some of the nickel guys that he's used in the past, they've just been nickel corners because there's a lot that you're putting on a guy if you're going to have him play both. So I think that they're moving Mitchell around, but they don't really want to. So ideally, I think they would just have guys play those specific roles, but I don't think they necessarily have the answers for that yet. So right now, it feels like without DeJean, their best five is probably, or the five they like the most, seems like it's Isaiah Rodgers at one outside cornerback spot, Darius Slay at one outside cornerback spot, Quinyon Mitchell at the nickel, and then Reed Blankenship, C.G. Gardner-Johnson at those two safety spots. And Avonte Maddox is there for a little bit of depth, but there's a chance he doesn't really make the roster. And then DeJean has just been hurt. He's back in individual drills, but he hasn't really practiced at full speed in a long time. So I still think that there's just a lot of unanswered questions about what that group is going to look like. And that's kind of why I had the same answer. Just like name a member of the secondary, because how that shakes out is going to be hugely important for determining this team's ceiling.
Yeah, no shade to Isaiah Rodgers, but I need Ringo out there, man.
I think that you could also throw out like guys in the spine of the defense because linebacker to me, a huge question. Like, right, what does Devin White look like in a more traditional defense where he's not rushing the passer 120 times? And David Long blitzed a lot for Vic Fangio last year, but not at the clip that Devin White was doing when he was with the Bucs. So what does he look like? Does Jordan Davis finally take that step? Does Jalen Carter go from being a good rookie, a very good rookie, to like a superstar level player? Like the margins with those guys and the steps we see from them, I think potentially go a long way in determining what this defense is.
The linebackers I kind of already chalked up to a loss, so it wasn't even like it wasn't really a question for me.
What counts as a successful season for this year's Eagles?
I would say winning the division is like a easy, simple goal to have, and then probably winning a playoff game, especially coming off of how the last season went. I think it's more important though to prove that the move to Kellen Moore, the move to this new style of offense, and like some of Jalen Hurts' potential development, that all of that was worth it, and that they hit on that. Like I think that's if you get the next step out of Jalen Hurts, that's a win.
Yeah, I think that division champs is 100% part of this, but then just a course correction on offense and defense. Like these things imploded last year, like complete implosion. So can you get this thing back on track? And if you do, what's interesting about this team and the way that they've been built, they got pretty young pretty fast. If you think about some of the transitions that happened, like they swapped out Reddick for Bryce Huff. They swapped out Bradbury for Quinyon Mitchell. They swapped out Kelsey for Cam Jurgens, even though Kelsey was still playing well. So because they had stockpiled so many picks over the last few years, they were kind of able to restock the cupboard with a lot of young pieces. And it also helps that for them, the money is fake, like we allotted to. So the fact that they were able to kind of do this in real time and change the age complexion of the roster over the last couple of years, if that course correction happens on both sides of the ball, this team is set up. Like they could be in a really, really good spot over the next couple of years if they figure that stuff out and we can just get back to competency with the way these things are structured on both sides of the ball.
I think that's a good way to put it, especially on defense. Like, yeah, it's a ton of new guys and they needed it. So that's spot on.
Your irresponsible player prediction for the Eagles this year.
Johnny Wilson, wide receiver 3. But I don't know about week 1. I think they have a stable of guys that they're interested in putting out there. But I think by the end of the year, he is their most interesting wide receiver 3 because I actually think he can play a little bit of inside and outside. He's more agile than he seems for a guy who is built like a literal tree. So I think that makes him pretty interesting to me. And then really, I think their other 2 receivers can move around a lot. You talked about, maybe
They're
AJ
going
Brown
to.
AJ Brown is going to move around a lot. DeVonta Smith has always been that kind of guy. So I don't think it's a worry of like, where are we going to play Johnny Wilson? It doesn't matter. They can figure it out with the other receivers they have. I just think by the end of the year, he's their best guy.
I also think it matters less in an offense that's going to include significantly more motion than it has in the past. Like just because where you start on a play doesn't determine where you're going to finish on a play. I think this offense before the snap is going to look a lot different this year. And we've only done this together for like a month. Your infatuation with just monstrous guys has been my favorite little thing, my favorite little quirk that's crept up. You just like these huge dudes that are just going to come out and just beat the shit out of other people.
I do, but you have to admit, he is like in a unicorn tier though. Like
that is very true.
Truly fascinating. Everybody should get this type of guy.
I mean, that's what Howie Roseman said during the draft when he was talking about guys that they seek out at the end of drafts. What do we look for when we're picking guys in the 5th, 6th, 7th round? We want dudes who are unusual. Are you unusual in some way? And Johnny Wilson is absolutely unusual in the way that he's built. I'm going with 15 sacks for Bryce Huff. Woo. And if you look at the per snap rates and what he was doing with the Jets, and it's not always, it's not always the graph goes straight up when you give a guy more of a workload. But if he moves into a full-time role, can that translate with a lot of help around him? I mean, there are really good pieces along that defensive line. So I'm a believer. Like they think he can be a full-time player. He's not that small. I mean, he weighs like 255 pounds. I mean, those are the types of edges we've seen from this team in the past. So I'm on board with like the full-time Bryce Huff and what we could potentially get from him.
I think if the interior takes a little bit of a step, both Davis and Carter, and give him some help, give him some space, I can get there. I like it.